Welcome to another episode of Playing the Bounce. We chat to Munster's biggest fan, Tom Savage, and we ask him, just because they've had a few South Africans in there, Rassie, CJ Stander, have they embraced abroad? And Benedict finds out, can Munster finally topple Leinster? Find out in this week's episode. Awesome. Yeah, Tom, thank you for joining myself and Benedict to come chat Munster. Obviously, we still believe it's the biggest province in Ireland, obviously because of Rassie and Johan van der Kraan. We want to know, are we right in saying that as the African fans? I mean, we call Munster our second home in the URC. Tom, what's your guys' feeling about the South African through Rassie and Johan van der Kraan?
Well, you're right there. It is main event Munster. The viewing figures back it up. I think over the last couple of years, and this is not even just going back to Rassie, even before that, the likes of Trevor Halstead, Wian de Pria, BJ Botha, guys who've come in and really impacted Munster over, I suppose, the last 20 years, maybe more. Rassie in particular, though, was a big change and a really important guy, I think, for Munster, especially over the season he was here. He was here for a full year, left then midway through the next one, but had a big impact during his time here. So I think in the, you look at like CJ Stander, guys like that have had a really big impact. And I think there's an affinity there between Munster and South Africa. I think it's reciprocated both ways, I think. And that's always kind of grated with me personally. And I think it's grated with a lot of Munster supporters also, because one thing you look about South African rugby, it's winning rugby, it's effective rugby. And that's always tended to gel well with the Munster psyche, I think.
I like that. I like you mentioned that it's winning rugby, because I think as South Africans, most of us do believe that style of rugby is the only way to play rugby. I do not believe in passing and all that nonsense that involves phase play and playing beautiful rugby, offloads.
Benedict, you're a forward, eh, Benedict? You're definitely a forward.
And we look back and we see that's how we won the World Cup as well. So talk to me about Munster. 1 win, 2 losses, new coach, if that makes sense. I mean, he was part of the coaching staff, but he's a new coach. A new attack coach, if I'm not wrong. Come from Racing, a lot of attack. Walk me through how your season started in Munster.
Season hasn't started well in Munster at all. There are a lot of changes going on from last year. I think looking at what we've seen so far, I think the coaches have made a fairly brave decision early on in their time here, before pre-season, that they were going to make fairly radical changes from last year. If you look at Munster last year from a style perspective, they were not one thing or the other. They weren't a huge kicking team. They weren't a massive phase play team. They were middle of the road for pretty much all the statistics that give a team an identity. Because I think you look at teams on field, you want to see a visual identity. I think everybody knows what the Springboks look like. Everybody would know, we'll see even what Leinster look like, the likes of Bristol. They all have an on-field identity. There's no one way to play the game. And I think looking at Munster last year, and even over the previous 3 seasons, I think Munster were a bit of a chameleon, where we would adapt to try to beat each team each week, depending on their strengths or weaknesses. And I think Munster, in doing so, weren't able to project our own strengths onto opposition teams. And as such, there wasn't really a huge visual identity as to what Munster were doing. There's no pressure on the coaches as such. I don't see any massive fan outcry over the results and performances so far. It seems to be mostly focused on the players. And that's something I think that needs to be rectified in the coming games for sure.
I like you mentioned that. We'll go to Kooks just now. I like you mentioned that there's almost like a change. And I love how you mentioned Mike Prendergast, because one stat that stands out at the moment for me personally is that right now Munster are second in offloads in the competition. They're 5th in defenders beaten. They're trying to play rugby and have that bit of balance instead of what they were last year. And obviously, when you work in rugby, you have to understand that they are going to need time to implement this. And it might not click on in the first season, but it might click on in the second season. the pressure now is, do you believe it will actually click on and it will work? Or coaches are going to get to a stage where because when coaches want to play attacking rugby and it doesn't work, they always go back to default. Do you think they will stick to this type of rugby for the greater good of the fans and the province?
I think there comes a point where all coaches have to, I suppose, surrender their ideals if results aren't going the way that they want. There's a pretty big game, like there's an Interpro season coming up now where there's going to be 3 games for Munster against Connacht, Ulster and Leinster. And they will tell an awful lot. There's no blank check, I suppose. At a certain point, you do have to win and you do have to produce coherent performances.
Tom, I got to ask, obviously at the start of the interview, you mentioned obviously Rassie and Johan van Kraan, and you mentioned how many South Africans have played for Munster. And I mean, as a South African, I've got to ask, have you guys embraced a braai? Is there a few barbecues on the side of the field before game day? Or maybe sneaking in the odd African beer? Is it still standard Guinness and no braais or barbecues yet?
No, well, the weather isn't usually very conducive to having barbecues over here most of the time. They'd end up being soup fairly quickly. But you look at the influence, I suppose, it's really added to, I suppose, the understanding of South African rugby. Like, I think a lot of Munster fans that I speak to look out for South Africa in the Rugby Championship and in the November internationals when Ireland aren't playing them, of course, or Munster actually. And it is like there is a liking, I think, for South African rugby for the most part.
And Tom, would you ever make the trip down here? When Munster comes on tour, obviously now the URC has changed. Things are different now. The South African sides are here. First of all, what do you think of the South African sides in the URC? And would you ever see yourself coming down here following Munster for a trip down here? I'm
looking to do it this season for the end of the URC season if I can. I've got a baby on the way though, so maybe that might not be fully cool. But I think I said this even when they were added to the United Rugby Championship last season to South African sides. They are going to be a huge problem for every team in this league. Without question. Even the first couple of games where the South African sides were losing a lot last season, I was just like, this will not stay. They will not keep losing. They're going to be a nightmare. And I was thinking the Bulls mainly. I was also thinking the Sharks. The Stormers were something of a surprise to me, but as they went on, I was there in Thomond Park when Munster played the Stormers last year. They were one of the best sides that I saw there all year. And I was looking at that game and going, these guys are going to be a big problem. Once they get back to South Africa, they're going to start racking up points down there, and that's exactly what happened.
I like how you mentioned that. I think that's what I love about South African rugby. Obviously, I'm a bit biased, but that's what I love about South African rugby, where when we stick to who we are, we not getting shaped by what other fans think, and we say, this is how we're going to play rugby. We embrace it. As long as we keep winning, we are going to be behind it all the time. Now, do you feel like this style of rugby, having South Africans come into the competition, is going to benefit Ireland, Wales, Scotland? Because when I read a couple of interviews from some of the Kiwi boys who are like, we miss the South Africans' physicality, we miss those tough games against South Africans because they offered something to them in preparation for what's to come. Now I'm looking ahead to the Ireland clash with South Africa at the end of year tour, potential clash in the World Cup. And hopefully, I now believe, I personally have put a bet that Ireland will probably make the semifinals. I don't know if to whose cost, but do you feel like there's a benefit to having these South Africans for the national sides in the URC?
100%. If you don't appreciate the value of what the South African sides give you, you have no idea about how the game is won at test level these days. I looked at, and this is something that the IRFU share as well, where they were speaking about the Emerging Ireland Tour, about the value of getting the Emerging Ireland team to play against the South African sides like the Griquas, Pumas, and the Cheetahs, because of the size and power that these teams have. That is the core of this game. If you can play around that or get yourself to a level where you can match it, you will be a match for any side in this game. Any side.
And Tom, obviously, we've got to ask you know, as one of the biggest Munster fans, and you're a huge Munster fan. And where did it start from you? When did you fall in love with the team? And also, how did you navigate the changes? I mean, from I mean, you've seen it all from Pro 12 to Pro 14 to URC, and you're watching rugby through a pandemic. So tell us like your story of how you fell in love with Munster and how it's been over the years.
It started in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s with Munster in the Heineken Cup. Before that, interprovincial rugby wasn't a huge thing. You'd kind of more watch your local club, be it Bandon, Clonakilty, because I had people who I knew in both clubs. And you would then, like Munster kind of became this big thing where it just kind of happened organically, where all of a sudden these were the games to go to. Like I remember going to see Munster versus Saracens in the early 2000s. You had the defeats in the finals, which were heartbreaking, but they drew you back in to go again the next season. And then it ended in 2005, 2006 with that Heineken Cup win. Trevor Halstead played a huge part in that as well, by the way, Sean Payne too. And that crystallized, I think, for a lot of people, a love for Munster and a love for, I suppose, the story and the identity that goes with it.
That's amazing.
I like that. Now, when we talk about that, I'm gonna ask not controversial, but I'm gonna ask a very interesting question. The bar remains Leinster in European rugby. Let's be fair. I heard Ronan O'Gara talk about it after La Rochelle's, when Leinster is the bar. When the Bulls, I actually feel like England rugby didn't win the World Cup. One, obviously because the South Africa is better, but because they were so focused on beating the All Blacks that when they had beaten the All Blacks, they thought everything was a foregone conclusion. When the Bulls beat Leinster, I felt like they had won their final already because, again, Leinster was the bar. And then that's why both teams got toppled. Do you ever think that Munster will ever get to a level where they surpass Leinster? Because Leinster at this very moment are the bar. And they didn't have too great a year last year, but when you look at it in the eyes of other clubs, it was still a year.
I hope so. I mean, you look at Munster, and I think this is the same. This is true for every great team, and there's no doubting Leinster are and have been a great side. If Leinster are the bar, then I think you just have to look for any slip in their standards or any mistakes they make to capitalize on. And I think that Munster are well placed to do that if certain things work out, but it will take a bit of luck, as it always does.
No, hopefully, the Bulls would love to topple Leinster again. And for our case, Tom would love to see a Bulls versus Munster final. Hopefully, we'll get you down to Loftus for a bra. I'm sure the baby will understand. But
yeah, I'll just explain afterwards.
Yeah, I will explain. Just bring a winner's medal, and then it'll be fine. But Tom, thanks for joining us. Benedict, as always. Outstanding. Thanks, James.
Cheers, Tom. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
All the best for the rest of the season to your Munster boys.
Just like in the game of rugby, you too can get better at playing the bounce in life. How? With the help of change science. Please go to the Change Exchange to learn how you can play the bounce.